Hey, so tonight we're stepping into one of the most legendary images of the Viking world, the feast. Hollywood gives you the flickering firelight, the golden goblets, the strong warriors singing songs of Odin with perfect braids in their hair. But what really happened in Viking feasts was a different story. Loud, dirty, chaotic, and often downright shameful. These weren't polite dinner parties. They were the kind of nights that ended with bruises, vomit, blood on the benches, and stories no skald would dare recite in a saga. Oh, and if you're enjoying these glimpses into the parts of history people try to tidy up, go ahead and like the video or subscribe. But only if you genuinely love what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It still blows my mind that people from across the world, from midnight listeners in London to early risers in Tokyo, are all joining the same story. So dim the lights, settle into your blanket, maybe grab a drink yourself, but be glad it isn't sour goat's milk or mead gone bad. And let's open the doors to a Viking hall at the height of celebration. The first thing that hits you isn't music, it's the smell. Smoke clings to everything. Your clothes, your hair, your lungs. The fire pit in the centre of the longhouse belches more smoke than warmth. And the narrow roof vents don't do much. The air is a choking stew of wood smoke, sweat, spilled ale, and the unmistakable tang of unwashed bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder. There's no such thing as personal space. You're elbow to elbow with farmers, warriors, women, children, and even the dogs that snarl under the tables, waiting for scraps. The floor is slick with mud and worse. Half the men didn't bother to wipe their boots. And with livestock wandering through during the day, you can guess what else is stuck to the rushes on the ground. Every so often, someone relieves themselves outside the hall and trudges back in, trailing the smell of the latrine. But no one cares. The stink is part of the atmosphere. At the centre of the feast lies the food. And while the sagas brag about roasted boars and endless ale, the truth is less glamorous. The meat is tough, the bread is black and gritty with ground up stone, and the fish has been salted so heavily, your lips crack just eating it. And yet, it's the best you'll get all year if you're lucky enough to be invited. The poor outside the walls, they're gnawing on bones thrown in the dirt. As the horns of mead are passed around, the boasting begins. Men pound their chests and tell exaggerated tales of raids, of stolen silver and women dragged back across the seas. The truth of the stories doesn't matter. What matters is who can drink the longest, shout the loudest, and humiliate their rivals in front of the crowd. Because make no mistake, Viking feasts weren't just about food. They were about status, shame, and spectacle. And with every horn drained, the shame grew deeper. Voices slurred, challenges were shouted. Sometimes men fought each other with fists, sometimes with axes. Sometimes they didn't stop until one of them was carried out cold, or worse. So yes, there was laughter, music and song, but there was also filth, blood and scandal. Viking feasts were less a noble ritual and more a chaotic release, a chance to show strength, to drown pain, to flirt with shame in ways that polite history has long since scrubbed clean. Welcome to the feast. If you picture a Viking feast, you probably imagine tables groaning under roasted boar, golden loaves, and platters of fish fresh from the fjord. And yes, sometimes that image wasn't entirely wrong, but only if you were rich or close enough to the local chieftain to sit at his table. The reality for most feasts was a lot less glorious and a lot more questionable. The centrepiece might indeed be a pig or a goat, roasted whole over the fire. But getting there wasn't pretty. Butchers hacked at the carcass on the dirt floor of the hall, and sanitation wasn't exactly a priority. blood pooled, dogs licked it up, and a servant swatted at flies that already laid claim. Meat wasn't always fresh. In the summer, it turned quickly, so people salted it until it burned your tongue, or smoked it until it was almost black. In winter, frozen cuts could thaw and refreeze several times before reaching the fire, crawling with unseen bacteria that no one had a name for. People just called it bad luck if half the guests got sick afterward. And then there was the bread. Forget soft white loaves. Viking bread was dark, heavy, and often gritty. Why gritty? Because when they ground grain on stone querns, tiny bits of rock got into the flour. Eating it wore down your teeth like sandpaper. Archaeologists examining Viking skeletons have found teeth ground down almost to the roots, abscesses bubbling in the bone, infections that would have left people in agony. Imagine chewing into your daily bread and knowing it was slowly destroying your mouth. Fish was a staple too, but again, not the romantic image of fresh salmon roasted over flames. Most fish at feasts was preserved, salted into slabs so tough you had to soak it in water to make it chewable, or dried so stiff it could double as a weapon. When you bit into it, flakes often crumbled into dust, sticking in your throat until you coughed. And the smell? Imagine a hall with 50 people eating dried fish while the fire only half clears the smoke. The air was thick enough to chew. Dairy showed up as well, bowls of sour milk, curds and cheese. But cows weren't always healthy, and without refrigeration, milk soured in hours. People drank it anyway. The result? Stomachs gurgling, bowels loosening, and guests slipping out to relieve themselves against the hall wall before stumbling back in. Hygiene didn't pause for feasts. It blended right in. And here's where it gets worse. Not all guests respected the food. Sometimes, as a deliberate insult, someone might toss a piece of meat on the floor, daring another to pick it up. Dogs snatched food straight from the tables, and no one stopped them. Children ran underfoot grabbing scraps. The line between human dining and animal feeding blurred quickly. Yet despite the filth, this food was valuable. It symbolized wealth, generosity, and power. A chieftain who couldn't provide enough was shamed. A guest who refused to eat what was offered risked insulting the host. And an insult in Viking culture could spiral into blood feud. So people swallowed their pride, their disgust, and whatever questionable stew was ladled into their bowls. And still the feast rolled on. Bellies filled, cups were refilled, voices grew louder, and the night shifted from food into something darker, competition, humiliation, and chaos. Because Viking feasts were never just about eating. They were stages, and the real performance was about to begin. When most people imagine Viking feasts, they picture only men. Bearded warriors, loud and drunk, slamming their cups and pounding the tables. But women were there too, and their role was far more complicated than the sagas like to admit. They weren't just passive decorations in the background. They could be servants, wives, concubines, or even honoured guests. And in every case, the hall was a dangerous stage for them. At the start of the feast, women often acted as cup-bearers. This wasn't a glamorous job. Picture yourself weaving through a smoke-choked room, carrying heavy horns of mead that slosh over your arms while drunken men pour at you. To refuse them would be to insult their honour. To yield too much made you a target. Viking culture celebrated drinking, but it also celebrated humiliation, and women were often caught in the middle. High-status women, such as the wives or daughters of chieftains, played a different role. They sat closer to the centre of the hall, in full view, where their beauty and behaviour reflected the prestige of their family. But visibility wasn't always a blessing. These women were gossiped about, judged for their clothing, their glances, even the way they poured a drink. A wrong word or laugh at the wrong time could spark whispers of unfaithfulness, whispers that, in Viking culture, sometimes ended in brutal punishment. And then there were the slaves. Viking raids brought back women from across Europe, Irish, Slavic, Frankish, dragged from their homes and forced into servitude. In the feasting hall, they were made to serve food, clean filth, and often satisfy desires no one spoke of openly, but everyone knew. They had no power, no protection, and no way out. For them, the feasts weren't celebrations. They were nights of endless labour, humiliation, and fear. But it wasn't only suffering. Feasts were also one of the few spaces where women could display influence. A clever woman might whisper advice to her husband during a lull in the drinking, or pass a horn to one man before another, signalling subtle favour or slight. In a society obsessed with honour, those gestures carried weight. A woman's choices at a feast could fan rivalries, encourage alliances, or even provoke duels. And then there were the games of desire. Feasts blurred boundaries. Men already drunk sang songs filled with sexual boasts and riddles, daring women to laugh or blush. Sometimes women gave as good as they got, crafting biting insults in return. Other times the attention turned cruel. A woman might be pulled onto a lap, kissed roughly, or shamed with bawdy jokes shouted across the table. And while the sagas romanticise these moments as proof of boldness, the reality was often much uglier. Harassment wrapped in tradition, perhaps the strangest detail. Women were also used as measures of humiliation. A man who lost a boasting contest might be mocked as less than a woman. A defeated warrior might be forced to sit in women's clothing as the hall howled with laughter. In these ways, femininity itself was turned into a weapon, a twisted tool of shame in a culture that prized masculinity above all. So, women in Viking feasts walked a razor's edge. They poured the drink, smiled at the right jokes, kept their composure through insults, and tried to survive until the fire died down. Some used wit and charm to carve space for themselves. Others endured in silence, but all of them knew that feasts weren't just about food and drink. They were about power, and in the hall, women were both part of it, and crushed by it. If the food was the opening act and the women moving through the hall were part of the tense spectacle, the main event of any Viking feast was always the drinking. Mead and ale weren't just refreshments, they were weapons, tests and traps. Drinking was how men measured each other's strength, and how they tore each other down in front of an audience. The horns came out, carved from oxen, polished to shine, sometimes tipped with silver if the host was wealthy. They weren't small mugs you could set down. A proper drinking horn might hold 1 litre or more, and once it was in your hand, you were expected to empty it in one go. To fail was to show weakness, and weakness was unforgivable. The games began with boasting. Each man, in turn, stood and shouted his deeds. Battles fought, raids survived, women conquered, wealth stolen. It was theatre, loud and exaggerated, but it had sharp edges. If another man thought you lied, he called you out. He might say you fled in battle, or worse, that you took the woman's place in bed. The hall erupted in laughter or anger. Words could turn to fists. Fists could turn to blades. More than one feast ended in blood on the floor, the smell of iron mixing with sour ale. Women weren't safe from these games either. Their names often became ammunition. A man might brag about bedding another's wife or slave. Sometimes women were forced to stand and be paraded as proof of a man's conquest. The sagas smooth this over, as playful banter, but in reality, it was humiliation. The woman reduced to a trophy, her reputation burned in front of everyone. The most dangerous drinking game was the flighting, a formalised insult contest. Two men faced off, taking turns throwing verbal daggers. The goal wasn't just to sting, but to utterly destroy the other's honour. Every secret, every failure, every rumour was fair game. And nothing was off limits. Accusations of cowardice, impotence, or even being no better than a slave woman. The crowd howled, each insult sharper than the last, until someone broke. And breaking could mean pulling a knife. And then there were the humiliations that blurred into ritual. A man too drunk to hold his horn might be stripped and mocked, forced to crawl on all fours like an animal. Sometimes he was dressed in women's clothes as the hall jeered. The act meant to brand him as unmanly. Other times his weakness was used as an excuse to spill ale over his head, or worse, urinate in his cup, while he lay passed out. Drunken cruelty had no limits, but the drinking wasn't always chaos. It had structure too. The chieftain or host controlled the pace, deciding who drank, when, and how much. His authority was measured in how he handled disputes. A weak host risked losing face if he couldn't contain the brawls. A strong one could turn insults into laughter and violence into applause. Feasts were arenas of politics as much as pleasure. Still under the smoke and laughter, there was fear. Everyone knew that one careless word could destroy a man's honour. Everyone knew that a spilled drink or mocking glance could ignite a fight that ended in death. And everyone knew that by the end of the night, someone would leave the hall shamed, beaten, or carried out on a shield. Because Viking feasts weren't about relaxation. They were trials, where drink was the judge, the jury, and often the executioner. By the time the horns had been drained and the hall was thick with smoke and sweat, feasts often shifted from loud boasting to something far more intimate and far more dangerous. Viking culture wrapped itself in ideals of honour and masculinity, but underneath those ideals was a world of scandal, lust and humiliation that the sagas only hint at. Sex was never far. From the centre of the feast, drinking songs slipped quickly into bawdy verses. Jokes about conquests grew cruder, and before long the lines between entertainment and exploitation blurred. Women, whether wives, concubines or slaves, became part of the spectacle. A man might drag a serving woman onto his lap and kiss her roughly, while others jeered. Another might boast of bedding two sisters or humiliating a rival by seducing his wife. These weren't whispered secrets, they were shouted across the firelight, daring someone to challenge them. Slaves had the least protection. They could be ordered to dance, sing, or strip for amusement. Some sagas carefully veil these scenes, calling them games or play, but the reality was rawer and crueler. To refuse was unthinkable. A slave's body was property, as much a part of the feast as the meat on the table. And yet these acts were wrapped in the justification of tradition. Feasts were celebrations of fertility, of life's abundance. What happened in the hall, they told themselves, honoured the gods. Even free women weren't immune. A wife who sat beside her husband might find herself pulled into the middle of a flighting contest. Her fidelity questioned, her looks mocked. She might be dared to kiss another man for luck, or shamed if she resisted. To laugh along was to survive. To object too loudly risked violence. Some women used wit and cunning to flip the shame back, hurling barbed insults that silenced even the drunkest warriors. But even so, the danger was always there. One misstep, one insult too sharp, and her words could bring ruin. The scandals didn't stop at heterosexual desire. The Vikings lived in a world where masculinity was sacred, but also strangely fragile. Accusations of unmanly acts, of taking the passive role in sex with another man, were among the harshest insults a rival could throw. And yet, drunken feasts blurred these taboos. There are whispers in the sagas and medieval chronicles of men bedding one another in the haze of ale. Acts later mocked in daylight as shameful, but excused in the hall as drunken folly. The contradiction was sharp, mocked in words, tolerated in shadows. Sometimes scandal wasn't about sex itself, but about the exposure of secrets. Imagine the hall roaring as a man reveals his rival's mistress, or boasts of catching a woman sneaking from another's bed. Feasts were breeding grounds for rumour, where alcohol loosened tongues and humiliation became entertainment. Reputations could be destroyed in a single night. The shame could even become ritualised. In some traditions, the loser of a contest was forced into a degrading punishment, crawling half-naked around the hall, dressed in women's clothes, or publicly miming sexual acts to the howls of the crowd. These rituals blurred cruelty with comedy, leaving scars that lasted long after the fire died out. And yet, for all its ugliness, the scandal was part of what made feasts so intoxicating. They weren't just about food and drink. They were about pushing limits of strength, of desire, of humiliation. For Vikings, the hall was where everything could be tested, even shame. If you picture a Viking feast as clean tables stacked with golden goblets, you've been lied to. The reality was far more brutal on the senses. Before a single horn of ale was raised, the hall itself reeked like a mixture of farm, battlefield, and unwashed humanity. The longhouse was usually built from timber, its walls insulated with turf, moss, or even animal dung to keep out the cold. The air inside was thick with smoke from the central fire, since the only chimney was a crude hole in the roof. Your eyes watered constantly, your clothes picked up the stench, and the back of your throat itched with soot. Add to that the smell of hundreds of bodies packed into a space with no ventilation. Sweat, leather, wet wool, and the sharp tang of unwashed skin formed a permanent fog of odour. And then there were the animals. Feasts weren't held in pristine banqueting halls. Chickens scratched in the corners, dogs fought over bones under the benches, pigs rooted through the scraps tossed to the floor. In winter, livestock were often brought indoors to keep them alive, which meant the floor could be slick with manure and straw. Your boots squelched as you walked, and you tried not to think too hard about what you just stepped in. The food itself added to the assault. Meat roasted on spits dripped fat onto the flames, creating a haze of greasy smoke. Bowls of stew were passed around, sometimes thick and hearty, sometimes crawling with weevils that had survived the boiling. Bread was coarse, often mould-flecked, and ale could taste more sour than sweet depending on how well it was brewed. Drinking horns weren't rinsed between uses. They were passed from hand to hand, each man's saliva blending into the mix. By the end of the night, the rim was sticky with spit and spilled mead. Hygiene was an afterthought at best. Hands wiped greasy with fat were smeared onto tunics or into hair. Bones and shells were hurled under the benches, creating a carpet of rotting leftovers. Rats were constant guests, darting between feet to steal morsels. Flies buzzed around, settling on open wounds or half-eaten meat with no distinction. The stench of decay was so normal that nobody commented on it. And then there was the human waste. A hall crammed with drunk men rarely had the patience for a trip outside. Chamber pots were sometimes placed near the doors, but many simply staggered out back or relieved themselves in dark corners. By the morning after, the feast floor could be a swamp of ale, urine, and worse, trampled into the rushes underfoot. No wonder Viking feasts often doubled as breeding grounds for disease. To make matters worse, feasts often lasted not just hours but days. The same hall, the same smoke, the same scraps piling higher, the same drunken bodies sprawled across the benches. By day 2, the stench was indescribable. Sweat-soaked wool, rancid meat, sour ale, human waste, animal droppings, and unwashed flesh blended into a single, choking atmosphere. If you've ever smelled a barn that hasn't been cleaned for weeks, imagine living inside it while drinking yourself senseless. And yet, this was part of the experience. The filth didn't ruin the feast, it heightened it. To endure the stench was to prove your toughness, your Viking resilience. Cleanliness was for the weak. The hall was supposed to be hot, smoky, disgusting. That was how you knew it was alive. By the time the horns were drained and the fires burned low, the line between human and beast blurred. The longhouse smelled like a barn because, for all intents and purposes, it was one. A barn where men feasted, fought, drank, and forgot themselves. For all their boasts of camaraderie and brotherhood, Viking feasts were powder kegs, waiting for a spark. The combination of endless drink, fragile pride, and sharpened steel meant that it wasn't a question of if violence would erupt. It was a question of when. It usually began with words, a boast stretched too far, or an insult tossed a little too sharp. A man might accuse another of cowardice in battle, of cheating at dice, or, worst of all, of being unmanly. These insults were designed to cut deeper than any blade, because they struck at honour, and in a society where reputation was life itself, to lose face was to lose everything. The sagas are filled with moments where the feasting hall shifted in an instant. Laughter turned to silence, joking voices became snarls, a hand that once held a horn of ale now gripped a knife. The tension would thicken until it snapped, and the hall exploded in chaos. Weapons were never far. Vikings didn't dress for dinner in silk. They came armed. A knife was tucked into every belt. An axe leaned against every bench. Shields sometimes even hung on the walls as decoration, ready to be ripped down in an instant. Fists were the first blows, but steel always followed. And when steel sang, the feast transformed. The long tables became barricades, benches overturned as men scrambled for cover. Blood pooled on the same rushes, already soaked with ale and urine. Dogs howled and fought over fallen scraps, or over fallen men. Women screamed, either fleeing for the corners or trying to pull their kin away from the slaughter. One saga tells of a wedding feast that turned into a massacre when a drunken guest mocked the bride's family. Within moments, blades were drawn, and by dawn, the hall was littered with corpses. Another story describes a man who, too drunk to defend himself, was pinned down and castrated in front of the roaring crowd. These were not rare events. They were the risk you accepted the moment you walked into the feast hall. The chieftain or host was supposed to keep order, but even he was vulnerable. If he lost control of the hall, his authority shattered along with it. Some tried to calm the crowd with more drink, others with threats, but a truly strong leader knew that violence could only be managed, not prevented. Sometimes he let the fight burn itself out, the strongest surviving to prove their worth. Other times he had to wade in with his own sword, cutting down both guest and enemy alike, just to remind everyone who ruled the hall. And then there was the ritualized violence, fights that were almost expected. In some feasts, men staged mock duels that turned very real once tempers flared. Gambling debts were settled with fists, Rivalries simmering for years erupted when the ale loosened tongues. Feasts were celebrations, but they were also release valves for anger and grudges, and the hall was the stage where it all came pouring out. The aftermath was grim. Bodies dragged outside, sometimes dumped into shallow graves, sometimes just left for the dogs. Blood scrubbed from the walls, with rushes that were already filthy. By morning the hall looked less like a place of joy, and more like a battlefield, smoky, foul and haunted by silence. And yet people came back again and again, because violence wasn't a failure of the feast, and it was part of it. To witness blood spilled, to survive a brawl, to walk out alive when others didn't, that was proof of strength. And in a Viking world, that mattered more than comfort, more than civility, more even than life itself. If the smell of roasting meat and the taste of sour ale defined the feast, then the soundscape gave it its soul. But don't imagine a polished orchestra or a soothing ballad. Viking music was raw, loud, and often as much about mockery as melody. At the heart of the noise were the skalds, poets, singers, and professional satirists who earned their place not with swords but with words sharp enough to cut deeper than steel. Their job wasn't just to entertain, it was to praise, to shame, to provoke. A skald could immortalise a warrior's deeds in verse, turning him into a legend in the eyes of the hall. But with a twist of his tongue, he could also reduce a proud chieftain to laughter and ridicule. Imagine the hall buzzing, torches flickering, mugs clattering when a skald stands to perform. His voice cuts through the din, weaving rhymes about a guest's cowardice in battle, or hinting that a man's wife had been less than faithful during his last voyage. The crowd roars with laughter, banging fists against tables, some spitting ale in amusement. The victim forces a grin, but inside his honour burns. If he lashes out, he risks being branded thin-skinned. If he stays silent, the shame sticks like tar. Either way, the skald wins. Music wasn't just for words. Drums, flutes, lyres, and even crude horns filled the air, with rhythms meant to amplify the chaos. A beat could push men into frenzied dances, stamping the rush-covered floor until the whole hall trembled. Other times, music was deliberately dissonant, harsh and jarring, to stir unease and whip the crowd into something just short of madness. But entertainment was never pure fun. It was dangerous, laced with humiliation. Women were often pulled into it, forced to dance or mocked for their looks. A slave might be made to sing a bawdy song until her voice cracked, only to be jeered for her performance. The cruelty was deliberate. Feasts thrived on a constant edge, where laughter could turn to violence in a blink. Even games were tainted with mockery. Drinking songs became competitions. Who could sing the filthiest verse? Who could insult their rival with the most cutting rhyme? A man who faltered was branded weak, and weakness was unforgivable in Viking culture. Sometimes losers were forced into humiliating punishments, crawling under tables like animals, or mimicking obscene acts while the hall erupted in drunken laughter. There's a reason why so many sagas feature poets and jesters at feasts. They were essential to the atmosphere, but they also embodied the danger of words. Words could build reputations higher than mountains, or drag them into the gutter. A careless boast could become a weapon in the skald's mouth, twisted into a verse that followed a man long after the fire had burned out. And beneath all the noise, the songs, the insults, the cruel laughter, was the unspoken truth. The feast was never just about joy. It was about testing limits. How much ale could you drink? How much shame could you endure? How sharp was your tongue? How hard could you laugh at someone else's humiliation? before the crowd turned and laughed at you. In that sense, music and mockery weren't entertainment at all. They were weapons, subtler than axes, but often more devastating. Because a scar from a blade might fade, but the sting of public ridicule? That could follow a man for life. Feasts were supposed to be about abundance, about celebrating the bounty of the harvest, the spoils of a raid or the honour of a chieftain. And sure, there were roasted meats and heaping platters of fish, but the way Vikings consumed them would horrify any modern sense of table manners. Picture this: no forks, no neat plates, not even personal bowls unless you were important. Most ate from shared wooden troughs, or tore chunks of meat directly off spits with greasy hands. Knives did double duty, cutting food and sometimes skin when tempers flared. The hall floor, already slick with ale and urine, became a dumping ground for bones, half-chewed scraps and spit. Dogs fought underfoot, gnawing on discarded gristle, while men laughed and shoved each other for the fattest cut. Meat was king: pork, beef, mutton, and sometimes horse. The fatter and greasier, the better. Delicacies weren't delicate at all. A roasted sheep's head was considered a prize, eyes and all. The tongue, a treat for those quick enough to snatch it. Fish, too, was everywhere, dried, salted, or boiled until it fell apart in greasy broth. Imagine the smell in a crowded hall already stinking of sweat, smoke, and sour ale. But the truly grotesque part wasn't the food itself, it was how it was consumed. Gluttony was celebrated. Eating until you retched wasn't shameful. It was proof of appetite, proof of strength. Guests boasted of downing entire legs of lamb, of swallowing sausages longer than their forearms. Some sagas describe men collapsing into their own vomit, only to be dragged up and urged to keep going. Puking at the table wasn't considered a disgrace. In fact, it often sparked laughter and bets on who could stuff themselves again afterward. And the drinks made it worse. Horns and mugs of ale were constantly refilled, sometimes mixed with honey to mask the sourness, sometimes with herbs that acted more like drugs than flavouring. Mead flowed, clouding judgment and loosening tongues. By the time bellies were bloated and heads spinning, the hall reeked of vomit, sweat, and spilled beer. The combination turned the place into less of a feast and more of a human sty. Slaves bore the brunt of the filth. They carried trays dripping with fat, wiped tables smeared with grease, and stepped carefully through puddles of vomit. Some were forced to eat the scraps, or lick the platters clean as part of the humiliation. If a slave dropped food or spilled ale on a guest, the punishment could be swift: a slap, a kick, sometimes worse. All of this unfolded while the honoured guests gorged themselves like beasts, and the cruelty didn't stop at the slaves. Sometimes food itself became a weapon. Men shoved chunks into each other's mouths until they choked, daring them to swallow. Others were mocked for eating too little, branded weak or womanly. The feast wasn't just a test of endurance in drinking, it was also a brutal competition of consumption. Even the chieftain used food as a tool of power. The choicest cuts went to his table first, reinforcing his dominance. To be given a bone with little meat was a subtle insult. To be ignored entirely was a warning. Hierarchy dripped from every greasy platter, and everyone knew it. By the end of the night, the floor looked less like the remains of a celebration, and more like the aftermath of a battlefield. Bones, vomit, grease, blood from a scuffle or two, all mixing together into a stink that clung to clothes and hair for days. And yet, to a Viking, this wasn't disgusting. This was the point. The feast was meant to overwhelm the senses, to drown you in food, drink, and chaos until you staggered away with your gut aching, your head pounding, and your reputation either sharpened or shattered. If gluttony and drunkenness pushed Viking feasts toward chaos, it was sex and humiliation that tipped them into scandal. Forget the clean stoic picture of Norse culture, so often painted in modern retellings. The sagas and whispered accounts make it clear. These gatherings could devolve into carnivals of lewdness, where shame was stripped away as quickly as clothing. Drunkenness blurred boundaries. Once bellies were full and mugs refilled again and again, the hall's energy shifted. Voices slurred, songs grew raunchier, and insults flew faster. Viking poetry, the ribald kind, was often recited aloud, mocking a man's manhood or accusing his wife of sleeping around. Laughter erupted, but it was sharp, cruel, and dangerous. What began as jest could escalate into violence or worse, into a forced proof of manliness before the entire hall. Women were central to this, though not always by choice. Shield maidens and freeborn women who attended feasts weren't simply passive observers. Some joined in, singing bawdy songs, joking about men's failures, or dancing provocatively to provoke cheers. But slaves and thralls, they had no such power. They were commanded to strip, to perform, to endure groping hands in front of jeering guests. To the Vikings, this wasn't shameful, it was entertainment. To the thrall, it was degradation beyond words. Public sex wasn't unusual. Drunken couples slipped into dark corners, but sometimes, in the frenzy of mead and bravado, they didn't bother with shadows. Loud couplings happened in front of the fire, cheered on by their peers. The sagas don't shy away from hinting at such scenes, where lust was paraded as a mark of vitality. The more outrageous, the louder the approval, but it wasn't always consensual. A particularly disturbing element was the use of humiliation as punishment. If a man was accused of cowardice, of lying, or of breaking an oath, he might be mocked with obscene gestures, or forced into degrading positions to prove his weakness. There are tales, whispered but persistent, of men being stripped and forced into acts meant to unman them in front of the crowd. The wordplay in Old Norse poetry often masked these humiliations in riddles and metaphors, but the underlying reality was clear. Shame could be sexualized, and sex could be weaponized. Even the drinking games turned lewd. Horns of mead were wagered not only on strength or wit, but on dares. Kiss that man, touch that woman, prove your virility in front of the hall. Refusal wasn't really an option. To say no was to invite accusations of weakness, or worse, of being less than a man. The Vikings prized reputation above almost anything else, and a single humiliating moment in a feast could stain you for life. For women too, the stakes were high. A wife accused of adultery might be forced to confess in humiliating fashion. A slave suspected of defiance could be paraded naked before all. The line between ritual and cruelty blurred, and often the chieftain or host allowed it, as long as the crowd was entertained. Feasts weren't just about food and drink, they were also about control. What makes it all the more disturbing is how normalised it was. These weren't one-off scandals whispered in shame. They were woven into the fabric of Viking feast culture, so accepted that poets and chroniclers could joke about them openly, using sly wordplay and double meanings that their audiences understood all too well. By the time the fires burned low and bodies lay sprawled across the hall in drunken stupor, the floor was littered not just with bones and vomit, but with the echoes of songs, the sting of insults, and the bruises of humiliation. What for one guest was a night of pleasure, and pride could be, for another, a night of degradation they could never shake. And this was the paradox of Viking feasts. They celebrated life with such intensity that they veered into cruelty, making spectacle of both vitality and shame. The fire has died down. The hall that only hours before wrought with laughter, songs and obscene dares now reeks of stale mead, sweat and vomit. The Viking feast was never designed with moderation in mind. It was excess, pure, unchecked and punishing. And when the sun rose, the price of the night had to be paid. For the lucky ones, the morning after meant only a splitting headache and a throat so dry it felt like swallowing sand. Mead was potent and rarely diluted. After several horns, even the strongest warrior staggered. Vomit-stained tunics were common, and so were men sprawled in their own filth, unable to rise until noon. The smell inside the longhouse was so overpowering that some stumbled outside to collapse in the mud rather than choke on the stench indoors. But the physical hangover was only part of it. What haunted many men and women after these gatherings were the scars to their honour. Vikings lived and died by reputation. A drunken slip of the tongue, an insult flung too carelessly, a challenge refused. These weren't forgotten the next day. They were remembered, retold, sharpened into biting sagas that spread from hall to hall. What seemed like a bawdy jest at midnight could ruin a man's name by morning, and the consequences could be bloody. If a man had insulted another's honour in public, the next day might bring a duel. Some feasts ended with challenges issued between staggering warriors who could barely stand. Others saw blades drawn immediately, turning merriment into murder. If blood wasn't spilled during the feast itself, it might be spilled in the cold light of dawn. For women, the aftermath could be even crueler. A wife who laughed too loudly at another man's joke might be accused of impropriety. A slave forced to perform in front of the hall might wake up bruised and beaten, only to be punished further for failing to please. And for some, the humiliation inflicted at night carried consequences that lasted a lifetime. Whispered stories about a woman's supposed shame could spread just as fast as tales of a man's cowardice. The hosts, too, bore a burden. A chieftain's feast was supposed to cement his power and reputation. If the night ended in chaos, if a guest was killed unjustly, if too many were left offended, if whispers of scandal spread too far, the host himself risked losing face. Sometimes fines were levied, sometimes blood money had to be paid, sometimes feuds erupted that lasted for generations. One feast could strengthen alliances, but it could just as easily shatter them. And then there were the bodies. Not everyone survived the night. Between drunken brawls, poisoned mead, and the occasional fire sparked by a toppled torch, feasts claimed lives. The dead might be dragged outside quietly, their families compensated later, but the memory of the disaster lingered. The longhouse itself bore scars too, floors sticky with spilled ale and blood, benches broken in fights, walls blackened with smoke. It often took days to restore order, to clean the mess, to patch the wounds, both physical and social, and even then the air never fully cleared. The stink of a Viking feast, sweat, sex, blood and mead, seemed to cling to the timbers long after the guests had gone. But perhaps the cruelest hangover was the one you couldn't escape: reputation. Men were mocked for years over drunken mistakes. Women bore slander that never truly faded. Slaves carried bruises and shame long after the hall was quiet. And the sagas, once composed, had a way of immortalising the most humiliating moments, ensuring they lived on long after the participants were gone. A Viking feast didn't end when the horns were emptied and the fires went out. It lingered in the aches of the body, in the whispers of the community, and in the fragile web of honour that bound society together. The feast gave life its spark, but the morning after showed its cost. To the Vikings, a feast was never just food and drink. It was also ritual, a way of binding the human to the divine. Every gathering was, in its own way, an offering. Animals were slaughtered, their blood splashed across the walls and altars, their meat roasted and shared as if the gods themselves were seated among the men. To refuse a toast, to leave a cup untouched, wasn't just an insult to your host. It could be seen as an insult to Odin, Thor, or Freya. But while the gods were honoured, the line between sacred and profane blurred fast. The same feast that opened with solemn oaths could dissolve into chaos so debauched that priests themselves were mocked and dragged into the mire. There are accounts of men swearing oaths to the gods, with bloody hands still wet from slaughter, then using those same hands to grope serving women moments later. Sacrifice and sin were never far apart. The rituals themselves could be shocking. Blood was collected in bowls and sprinkled with twigs across guests and walls, a messy and sticky reminder that life came from death. Some guests wore the gore proudly, claiming it was Odin's blessing. Others retched but dared not wipe it off, fearful of appearing weak. Bones of slaughtered animals piled in corners of the longhouse, attracting dogs that fought noisily over scraps, adding to the sense that the divine and the disgusting were inseparable. Even the toasts had their own strange weight. Drinking horns were raised, not just to honour the gods, but also to curse enemies. One man might drink to Odin's wisdom, while another raised his horn to the downfall of Eric across the fjord. These curses were taken seriously. Men believed that by drinking to a person's ruin, they called the gods into the feud. A careless toast could condemn a rival, or spark a blood feud that lasted generations. Women also played roles in these rituals. A lady of the hall might be tasked with carrying the ceremonial horn, offering it first to the most honoured guest. In doing so, she embodied not just hospitality, but also the goddess Freya, a symbol of fertility and desire. But behind the ritualistic grace there was tension. Everyone watched her closely. Did she hesitate before offering it to a rival? Did her hand linger a little too long when serving one man? Such gestures were enough to fuel scandalous rumours for years. And while gods were invoked, demons were always near. Vikings believed feasts were prime ground for spirits to intrude. Drunkenness blurred the line between this world and the other. It wasn't unusual for a man to claim that Odin or Loki had whispered in his ear during a particularly heavy night of drinking. Such claims weren't dismissed. Sometimes they were feared. A man might earn sudden authority in the hall simply by declaring that the gods had chosen him in that moment of chaos. Yet not every divine moment was solemn. Some rituals were outright obscene. Men might strip naked and dance to honour fertility gods, slapping their thighs and groins in exaggerated mockery. Women, sometimes encouraged, sometimes forced, were drawn into these fertility rites, singing songs that were equal parts worship and bawdy insult. To an outsider, it might look like blasphemy. To a Viking, it was simply life, raw, unfiltered, and sacred in its own dirt. What really happened in Viking feasts was that the sacred was never safe from the profane. The gods were toasted alongside drunken curses, sacrifices were followed by brawls, and rituals of fertility dissolved into lewd parody. The Longhouse was both temple and tavern, a place where the divine demanded blood and the mortals demanded more mead. By morning, the gods had been honoured, and also mocked, twisted, and drowned in drink. And yet the cycle always began again. For Vikings, chaos itself was a form of worship. If you think Viking feasts were just noisy drinking sessions with the occasional brawl, you're still too clean. The truth is that behind the smoke and song, guests broke taboos so openly that later Christian scribes wrote about them with disgust. And even then, they likely toned things down. Let's start with food. Vikings were proud hunters and farmers, but at a feast, the desperation to show abundance sometimes went too far. Half-rotten meat was salted and served anyway, sometimes crawling with maggots. In poorer halls, seals and horses were slaughtered, even though both carried spiritual taboos. Eating horse flesh was linked to fertility rituals, but it also scandalized outsiders. When missionaries came, they made Viking chieftains swear to abandon the practice because it was considered too obscene. But in the longhouse, guests would chew through gristly horse haunch while laughing at the priest's disgust. And then there were drinking rituals. Mead and ale weren't enough for some men. Archaeological evidence hints at hallucinogenic mushrooms being consumed in certain parts of Scandinavia. Imagine the scene. Men already staggering drunk, suddenly seeing visions, shouting prophecies, or stripping naked in fits of frenzy. What was sacred became grotesque. Some would claim the gods spoke through them. Others simply collapsed in their own filth. Nobody stopped them. It was all part of the chaos. Sexual behaviour also slipped quickly into forbidden territory. Feasts blurred boundaries. With dim firelight, thick smoke, and everyone drunk, men and women, and not always married couples, slipped away into corners. Some sagas hint at group rituals, where fertility gods were invoked by actual acts performed in the hall, hidden under cloaks or furs while songs covered the noise. The sagas never give detail, but the fact that Christian scribes were so scandalized by heathen feasts speaks volumes. What they called orgiastic rites may have been half religion, half release. Cross-dressing also appears in the darker whispers. To mock rivals, men were sometimes forced to dress in women's clothing at feasts, an act seen as the ultimate insult. In a society where masculinity was everything, being made to wear a dress in front of peers wasn't funny. It was a humiliation designed to destroy a man's honour. Sometimes, these humiliations were followed by violence. A drunken prank could spark a feud that lasted decades. And what about bodily functions? In the sagas, heroes vomit, bleed and defecate without shame in the middle of the hall. Imagine a packed room of hundreds of people, the floor already slick with spilled beer and blood from fights, and then someone, too drunk to make it outside, relieving themselves in the corner. Dogs rushed to lick it up, men jeered, and the feast rolled on. Cleanliness wasn't the point, excess was. Women, again, bore the brunt of this chaos. Female slaves could be paraded as entertainment. Some were mocked, forced to pour drinks in humiliating ways, or even offered to guests as gifts. The sagas avoid the dirtiest details, but it's not hard to imagine what that meant in practice. For a slave woman, a Viking feast could be a night of pure terror, hidden behind the clamour of drums and horns. One more taboo: cannibalism. Now let's be clear, there's no solid evidence that Vikings practiced this regularly. But certain accounts from horrified outsiders suggest that in moments of extreme ritual or desperate famine, there may have been acts that skirted dangerously close. Whether exaggerated propaganda or not, the fact that such stories circulated tells us something about how outsiders viewed Viking feasts. Not just wild, but terrifyingly without limits. What really shocks is how normalised all this was. For Vikings, the feast wasn't about rules, it was about testing the edges of society. The more taboo broken, the greater the reputation of the hall. A feast where nothing shocking happened wasn't remembered. But a feast where someone dressed as Freya, where horse blood was spilled, where a slave girl was humiliated before the gods, that became legend. And so, while sagas celebrated the victories of kings, the feasts themselves told the truer story. Honour was messy, glory was cruel, and shame was often served on the same platter as roasted meat. If the beginning of a Viking feast was all about excess and showing off wealth, the end was almost always about chaos. The sagas are littered with moments when the mead ran out, the fires burned low, and the masks of hospitality slipped. That's when things got ugly. The simplest problem was drunken rage. When every man in the room had drunk more than his fill, insults became unavoidable. A careless word, a drunken boast, or a mocking song could turn a friend into a blood enemy. Viking society ran on honour, and an insult delivered at a feast was a public wound that demanded a public answer. To leave it unanswered would be worse than the insult itself. And so knives flashed, axes swung, and a hall meant for celebration became a killing ground. One saga tells of a man mocked for his poor courage, a fatal insult in Norse culture. Too drunk to restrain himself, he leapt across the table and drove his knife into his rival's chest. Within seconds, the benches collapsed, bowls smashed, and half the hall was fighting. Imagine the flickering firelight on blood pooling into the rushes, the smell of meat mixing with iron. By dawn, the feast that began with boasting songs ended with bodies being dragged out into the snow. This wasn't just drunken brawling. It was the seed of feuds that could last for generations. An insult at a feast might lead to the death of one man, then a retaliatory raid on his family's farm, then another ambush. Whole sagas are nothing more than chains of revenge, sparked by a single moment of shame in a hall filled with witnesses. A feast was never forgotten because too many people were there to remember it. And speaking of shame, the games of humiliation played during these nights could ruin reputations permanently. Being mocked as cowardly, being forced to cross-dress, or being accused of passive homosexual behaviour, which in Viking culture was considered the lowest insult to a man's masculinity, could destroy one's standing forever. Men were expected to fight such slanders with blood. If they didn't, they were branded Nidinga, a man without honour. That label was worse than death, and it followed a family for generations. But violence wasn't always confined to men. Women too found themselves caught in the aftermath. Feasts were one of the few public stages where women could speak openly, especially in the role of cupbearers or hostesses. A sharp-tongued woman could use the moment to humiliate a rival, stoking tensions that men were then forced to resolve. Some sagas describe wives goading their husbands into duels, deliberately fanning the flames until blood was spilled. A clever woman could steer the entire course of a feud with a single pointed remark. Then there were the deaths nobody wanted to talk about, the quiet ones. Slaves beaten after spilling ale, serving girls strangled for refusing advances, thralls simply collapsing from exhaustion in the aftermath. These weren't the glorious sagas of kings and warriors, but they were just as real. For the people at the very bottom, the end of a feast wasn't a hangover. It was terror, punishment, or silence. Even when blood wasn't spilled, the hangover itself was brutal. Imagine waking up on a straw mattress, soaked with sweat and vomit, the stench of stale mead filling the air, dogs sniffing at the remains of food scattered across the floor. Outside, the cold bit at your bones, but inside your head pounded from hours of shouting, drinking, and smoke. Some men didn't wake up at all. They simply drank themselves to death, their bodies dragged out like broken cups, once the hall cleared. The strange truth is that this was expected. Nobody went to a feast thinking it would end cleanly. You didn't gather dozens or hundreds of armed men, flood them with alcohol, mix in taboos and humiliations, and expect everyone to part with handshakes. A feast without violence wasn't a feast worth remembering. In fact, many sagas only mention feasts because of the blood spilled at them. In the end, Viking feasts weren't just about eating and drinking. They were pressure cookers, where reputations were made and destroyed, where a single word could ignite generations of killing, and where shame was as deadly as a sword. The longhouse didn't just echo with laughter and music. It echoed with screams, oaths of vengeance, and the knowledge that the next feast might be your last. If Viking sagas glorified feasts as places of courage and chaos, Christian chroniclers saw them as straight-up nightmares. When monks, priests, or later missionaries wrote about Viking celebrations, they didn't just wrinkle their noses, they recoiled in horror. To them, these gatherings weren't just drunken parties, they were pagan orgies, devil's banquets, and living proof that the Northmen were beyond redemption. One of the earliest accounts comes from a monk describing Viking rituals in Denmark. Long halls full of noise, meat sizzling on spits, men and women swaying in drunken frenzy, and what he calls shameful acts of the body, carried out without shame. That's monk speak for exactly what you think. The clergy painted these feasts as dens of sin where no commandment was safe, lust, gluttony, wrath, pride, envy, all packed under one smoky roof. What really shocked the church wasn't just the drinking, it was the lack of restraint. In Christian Europe, feasting had rules, monks ate in silence, nobles followed strict etiquette, and even kings were supposed to bless their meals with prayers. But the Vikings? They sang obscene songs, mocked each other, spilled food on the floor, and dared the gods to watch. Imagine a monk used to chanting psalms, at dinner suddenly stumbling into a hall where men were belching contests, while women flashed them for laughs. To the church, this wasn't just rude, it was satanic. Some chroniclers went further, describing feasts as places of ritual sacrifice. They claimed animals were slaughtered in front of guests, with blood splashed on the walls, and even drunk in cups. Archaeology has backed up some of this. Bones found in feasting pits show animals killed in ways that suggest ritual, not just dinner prep. Add enough mead, and those rituals blurred into something the monks called blasphemous orgies. And then there was the nudity. One horrified account from a Christian visitor in the 10th century claimed Viking women bared themselves during dances, circling the hall while men howled and drummed. Whether this was exaggerated or not, it fit the church's picture of Vikings as wild pagans, ruled by their animal instincts. In sermons, priests used these feasts as cautionary tales. Look at the Northmen, who live like beasts. Do you want your soul to end up like theirs? But here's the uncomfortable truth. Much of this horror was real. Feasts were messy, obscene, and often violent. But the monks also had an agenda. Painting Viking life as grotesque made it easier to justify crusades, conversions, and wars. The more monstrous the feast sounded, the more righteous Christian kings felt when they marched north to save souls. Still, it wasn't all propaganda. Even sympathetic travellers admitted they had never seen such excess. One Arab ambassador to the Rus, Viking traders in what's now Russia, described men and women drinking themselves senseless, then lying together openly in front of others, as if privacy didn't exist. To him, it was barbaric, shocking, and almost unbelievable, yet he recorded it because he saw it with his own eyes. And that's the divide. To Vikings, these feasts were moments of bonding, rituals that tied men to their gods and each other. To the church, they were proof that the Vikings were filthy, depraved, and doomed to hellfire. Both sides were right in their own way. But one thing's for sure, the Christian writers made sure these feasts lived on in infamy. They described every obscene song, every drunken fight, every naked dance with the precision of people who couldn't look away. Their disgust became history, and their words turned smoky longhouses into eternal symbols of pagan sin. So the next time you read about Vikings as noble warriors with horned helmets, which they never wore by the way, remember the other side of the story. To their enemies, the feast was the darkest part of their culture, a place where honour, lust and violence mingled until outsiders saw only madness. And in a way, that's exactly why the feasts worked. They weren't meant to look respectable. They were meant to shock, to terrify, to burn themselves into the memory of anyone unlucky enough to witness one. When the last fires of the Viking Age burned out, the world didn't forget the warriors or their ships. But oddly enough, what lingered just as strongly were the feasts. Centuries later, people still talk about them, still write about them, still imagine what it must have been like to step inside one of those smoky, chaotic halls where the air reeked of meat, sweat, and spilled ale. Part of that legacy is legend. The sagas turned feasts into stages for heroes, with kings showing off their generosity, warriors testing their bravery in games of strength, and skalds immortalising it all in drunken poetry. To the Norse themselves, the feast wasn't just a party, it was the glue that held their world together. A place where alliances were sealed, promises sworn, and reputations made or destroyed in a single night. But there's also another layer, one modern people find both fascinating and repulsive. The filth, the shamelessness, the parts that polite medieval scribes tried to censor. We remember Viking feasts not because they were elegant, but because they were outrageous. Where else in medieval Europe could you find elite warriors puking on the floor, women dancing half naked by firelight, and insults traded with the same seriousness as a duel? To everyone outside the Norse world, this looked like madness. To the Vikings, it was tradition. Even now, the legacy of those feasts lives on in how we imagine the Viking Age. Every TV show or movie with horned mugs of ale, every Renaissance fair with roasted meat on spits, every drinking game that dares people to outlast their rivals, it all echoes the old halls of Scandinavia. Of course, the real thing was dirtier, darker, and far less glamorous than Hollywood dares to admit. The smell alone would have driven modern partygoers running for the hills. The church, ironically, also kept the memory alive by condemning the feasts in sermons, by writing them down as examples of pagan wickedness. Priests guaranteed they would never be forgotten. What was supposed to be a warning turned into fascination. Readers centuries later weren't horrified, they were curious. What kind of people lived like this? What kind of culture found joy in excess and disgrace in equal measure? And then there's the uncomfortable truth. Maybe part of us envies it. In an age where dinners are polite, orderly, and governed by rules of etiquette, the idea of a feast where anything goes, where songs get raunchier, fights break out, and laughter drowns the shame, has a strange forbidden appeal. The Viking feast was chaos given permission, a night where everyone dropped the mask and indulged. Yet behind the laughter and noise, there was always the shadow of violence. Feasts could end in friendship, or they could end in blood. That tension is part of their power. You never knew whether you'd leave the hall with a new ally or never leave at all. That's why they remain unforgettable. because they balanced on the knife's edge between joy and danger, excess and disaster. Today, when we look back, Viking feasts symbolise more than food and drink. They symbolise the raw humanity of the Norse, fearless, reckless, messy and unapologetic. They didn't feast because it was clean or noble. They feasted because it was the truest expression of who they were, a people who embraced life, even when it was ugly, and stared death in the face without blinking. So the next time you raise a glass at dinner, picture that long smoky hall. Picture the meat sizzling, the mead overflowing, the insults flying, and the laughter shaking the rafters. You wouldn't have survived a night in a Viking feast, but you'd never have forgotten it. And maybe, just maybe, that's the real reason we're still talking about them. If you strip away the shouting, the drinking, and the smell of roasted meat, one figure stood out in the middle of the chaos: the skald. To most people today, a skald was just a poet, a kind of Viking bard. But in the world of feasts, they were so much more: performers, satirists, historians, and sometimes executioners of reputations. A skald could make a man immortal in verse, or he could destroy him with a single, cutting insult sung before a roaring crowd. Imagine it. The firelight flickers across benches crowded with warriors and farmers alike, all of them flushed with mead. Then the skald rises, harp in hand, his voice cutting through the noise. Suddenly the feast goes silent. Every man listens, every woman leans forward, because what comes next might lift a name to the heavens, or drag it down into the dirt. Skalds wielded language like a blade. A praise poem could elevate a chieftain, turning a minor victory into a saga worthy of Odin's halls. But a mockery poem, that was poison. It could brand a warrior as weak, a man as unmanly, or a woman as loose. And the worst part, the insult would stick. Once sung in a feast, it would spread from hall to hall, carried on tongues like wildfire. This made skalds both revered and feared. People showered them with gifts, silver rings, cloaks, sometimes even land, just to ensure their verses stayed flattering. But even that didn't guarantee safety. Many sagas tell of skalds who pushed too far, their sharp tongues earning them a dagger in the ribs before morning. They played a dangerous game, balancing flattery and scorn. Women, too, could fall victim. There are accounts of skalds mocking women for sleeping with the wrong man, or for being too bold at the feast. In a culture obsessed with reputation, these verses were lethal. No duel could erase the shame, once the skald had spoken it aloud. And yet some women fought back with words of their own. There are fragments of poetry preserved that suggest women composed biting retorts, turning the insults back at the men. It didn't always save their reputation, but it showed that Viking women weren't just silent victims in the spectacle of the feast. And then there was the darker side. Skalds often turned filth into art. Some of the best preserved verses from this period are shockingly obscene, packed with sexual jokes, bathroom humour, and imagery that would scandalise even a modern audience. These weren't accidents. The shock value was part of the performance, part of the thrill of the feast. When everyone was half drunk and looking for a laugh, nothing got the hall roaring louder than a dirty verse that pushed the boundaries of decency. Think about that. The same culture that produced epic tales of gods and heroes also preserved verses about bodily functions and bedroom misadventures. It wasn't hypocrisy, it was honesty. The Vikings didn't separate the sacred from the vulgar. Both had their place, especially in the hall. The skalds ensured Viking feasts were never just about eating and drinking. They were about memory. What happened in the hall didn't stay in the hall. It lived on in verse. And that meant every joke, every humiliation, every drunken brawl could be immortalised. That's why people feared the scald almost as much as they feared the sword. A blade could kill your body. A verse could kill your legacy. And so, in the middle of the spilled ale and greasy bones, you had this strange figure, part artist, part executioner, part clown. The scald embodied the Viking feast itself, raw, dangerous, unfiltered and unforgettable. Viking feasts sound endless when you picture them in saga. The tables groaning with roasted meats, bowls of stewed vegetables, rivers of mead flowing until dawn. But the reality was far less romantic. Food was seasonal, storage was primitive, and the line between a feast and a famine was razor thin. When a feast went wrong, it could turn from celebration into humiliation, or worse, violence. In theory, the host was obligated to provide enough food and drink for everyone. To run out was a mark of shame, a black mark that lingered long after the fires died down. People remembered who hosted the feast that fell short. Whispers spread through the valleys. He can't feed his men. For a chieftain, that kind of reputation could be fatal. Feasts weren't just entertainment. They were proof of wealth, proof of power, proof you could lead men into battle. So, what happened when the supplies failed? The records hint at desperate improvisations. Thin stew made from old dried fish, grain mixed with bark to stretch the bread, and watered down mead that tasted more like sour rainwater than honey. Guests noticed and they mocked. Even worse, they might simply leave, walking out mid-feast to show contempt for their host. That was political suicide for any man who wanted loyalty. And then came the darker stories. Archaeologists have uncovered bones with cut marks in old feast sites, leading to whispered speculation. Did some Viking halls resort to eating things, or people, they shouldn't when food ran low? Saga writers loved to hint at such grotesque possibilities, though they wrapped them in myth and metaphor. Still, the message was clear. A feast without food wasn't just embarrassing, it could be catastrophic. Guests themselves could turn ugly when the bowls came up empty. Imagine a hall filled with warriors who'd marched miles, stomachs rumbling, only to be handed scraps. Insults flew, fights broke out. Sometimes whole feasts dissolved into chaos, with benches overturned, cups smashed, and blood spilled on the rushes. A feast meant to bind allies could end with enemies instead. Women often bore the brunt of the blame when shortages occurred. If the cooking failed or the beer soured, it was whispered that the women of the hall were at fault. There are sagas that describe wives being publicly scolded, or worse, for ruining the feast, even though the real cause was often poor harvests or greedy lords. In this way, women became scapegoats for the failures of men, desperate to save face. But shortages didn't always end in disaster. Some chieftains turned lack into spectacle, spinning it as a kind of test. Instead of fine cuts of beef, they would serve what today might be considered peasant food: boiled sheep heads, dried fish guts, or porridge so thick it could hold a spoon upright. Then the skalds would sin about it, as proof of toughness. See how we endure hardship better than our enemies. It was a clever trick, turning poverty into pride. Still, no amount of poetry could hide the truth. Viking feasts were only as grand as the harvest allowed, and in a world of long winters, failed crops, and raiding gone wrong, plenty of feasts ended with grumbling bellies instead of full hearts. What's striking is how quickly a shortage could unravel the illusion of abundance. One bad night and a leader's reputation collapsed. It wasn't just about meat and mead. It was about trust. If you couldn't provide at the feast, how could you provide in war? So while sagas remember the nights of plenty, the roaring fires, the laughter, the rivers of ale. Reality was far more fragile. For every tale of bounty, there were feasts of thin soup, sour beer, and shame that lasted a lifetime. Because in the Viking world, hunger was never far away, and when it arrived, it didn't just gnaw at the stomach, it gnawed at honour itself. By the time the fires burned low and the last mugs of mead were drained, Viking feasts had shifted from celebration into something far more complicated. On the surface, they were moments of unity, families gathered, warriors bonded, oaths sworn, but underneath the noise and the laughter lurked all the dirt, the shame, and the danger we've traced through these halls. When the skalds sang, they praised glory and generosity, but they left out the smell of vomit in the corners, the sticky rushes soaked with beer, and worse, the women cleaning long after the warriors stumbled off to sleep. They forgot to mention the broken bones after fights, the feuds sparked over insults, or the shame that clung to a family when food ran short. For the women especially, the end of a feast was rarely the end of work. They were the ones scrubbing the benches, gathering the bones, and quietly tending to bruises or cuts sustained in drunken quarrels. If a man had overindulged and disgraced himself, it often fell on the women to soothe his pride or hide the damage. And if guests overstayed their welcome, it was the women of the household who endured the grumbling, the mess, and sometimes the harassment. Yet the feast wasn't only misery, it was also power. For all its filth and fury, the Viking feast was how alliances were made, marriages arranged, rivalries settled or ignited. The drunken insults and the blood spilled on the floor mattered because they shaped politics. In a world without written contracts or courts, a feast was both parliament and battlefield. Every toast, every gift of meat, every glance carried weight. Religion, too, wove itself into the feast's end. Before the warriors stumbled out into the cold night, horns were often raised to the gods, Odin for victory, Thor for strength, Freya for fertility and good harvests. Some feasts ended with sacrifices, sometimes of animals, sometimes whispered to be human. The line between faith and frenzy blurred. To eat, drink, fight and bleed under the eyes of the gods was as much worship as it was indulgence. And when dawn crept in, the hall looked less like a temple of glory and more like the aftermath of a brawl. Benches overturned, dishes cracked, the stench of smoke, sweat and spilt ale thick in the air. The hosts might smile for the songs that would be told, but they knew the truth. Every feast carried risks. One wrong word, one bad cask of mead, one empty platter, and the whole night could sour into disaster. That's the part sagas rarely dwell on. They give us the romance, the roaring fires, the endless meat, the heroic toasts. But if you scrape away the poetry, you find the grime of reality. Feasts were not endless joyrides of abundance. They were fragile, volatile performances, always at the edge of collapse. And maybe that's what makes them fascinating. Because inside those smoky halls, you glimpse the Viking world as it truly was. Rough, raw, dangerous, human. A place where laughter and violence shared the same table, where honour and shame could trade places in a heartbeat, and where the same feast that united a people could also tear them apart. So the next time you picture Vikings raising their horns in a perfect toast, remember the dirt between the cracks. Remember the women sweeping in silence when the songs ended. Remember the hunger just outside the hall, and the fights that started with a careless word. That's what really happened in Viking feasts, not the polished version, not the saga of endless glory, but the messy, complicated truth. Because for the Vikings, as for us, the feast was never just about food, it was about power, and power has always been messy.